Welcome to every single one of you who's able to join us today for Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle in which all of us have the chance to draw from the deep wisdom of many different traditions, old and newer traditions around the world, and also from our own personal depths of experience as souls. Long history and really a lot of searching that has much to share with one another. So we welcome all of you to today's consideration of Mahatma Gandhi on the topic of all men are brothers. And I would like to say that this was a phrase of his that he was using back maybe 80 years ago. If I were to rename it, I would name it something like all humanity are siblings. I think we need a new word, siblinghood. That nevertheless doesn't detract from the importance and depth of what we're going to be taking up today. And also a little bit of the lightheartedness that I want to mention, because this is the week that at Stella Moving Center, we're really thinking about the children. We're thinking about the future, whom I'm sure Gandhi had at heart with everything that he did. Our speaker this week is somebody I know pretty well. We both went to Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara together, and we had a really inspiring professor, Professor Raghavan Iyer, who wrote a seminal work called The Moral and Political Thought of Mahatma Gandhi. And that is where Cliff and I really got to be acquainted a little bit with the importance of this person, Mahatma Gandhi. And it really profoundly has affected both of our lives. I just want to mention a little bit in terms of his power to affect people past his own age. That I'm speaking of Gandhi's now. Cliff was so inspired by Gandhi's devotion to the book that he read from every single day. It's a Hindu text called the Bhagavad Gita that he went on to study Sanskrit so that he could translate that book for himself and read it in its original language. And he also took from Gandhi the idea of being a karma yogin, which is somebody who lives a life in the world, a life of service and action. And I think he does a good job exemplifying that. His most recent project is helping to found a tiny house village for the homeless in Waimanalo on the east side of Oahu. So he wants me to stop talking and just let him talk about Gandhi. Cliff, please.
Well, thank you for letting me initiate this conversation on Gandhi and siblinghood. First, I'd just like to say how amazing these Zoom things are. I mean, from North Carolina to California to Hawaii, it's kind of like this pandemic has given us all lemons, but somehow the Stella Moving Center is making lemonade out of it all. So, I mean, it's pretty amazing to see all your faces out there. So I'd also like to initiate this conversation by getting into a debate or an argument with my wife over the title for these gems from the wisdom traditions, because from my perspective, there's only one wisdom tradition that weaves itself through all the great religions, philosophies, cultures of the world. And the wise beings that are part of this tradition, even though they may speak different dialects and come from different places, they all, in some sense, speak one language, which is the upliftment, the spiritual upliftment of all of humanity. So I'm reminded of a quote by Krishna where he says that of all the human beings in the world, or of thousands and thousands of human beings, perhaps a single one strives for wisdom. And of those so striving, only a single one may actually reach the goal of wisdom, which is kind of discouraging. But shortly thereafter, he says that, but even a little of this wisdom delivers a person from great risk. So we may not be wise, but by trying through these gems of the wisdom tradition or traditions, we might get enough to keep us out of great risk. But what is the difference between wisdom and knowledge? I would say that knowledge comes to us from without. Even if we have a brilliant mind and can take and assimilate all this knowledge that we bring into ourselves and then bring it back out in a creative and new manner, an original manner, it's still not the same thing as wisdom. Wisdom, we think, comes from within. Even a wise guru cannot give us wisdom. He can only point the way for us to find wisdom within ourselves. We have to tap that reservoir in ourselves. Wisdom, we think, has to do with bringing together both knowing and being. And in the case of Gandhi, also doing. He would say doing is a big part of gaining wisdom. And we've been looking a lot at the Eightfold Path of the Buddha. And the Eightfold Path of the Buddha is really, when you think about it, a path of knowing, it's a path of being, and it's also a path of doing. It's a path of self-transformation. We were really struck last week by Tony's presentation on Zen Buddhism and how he and his father would start the day, Diana. And it just seemed like that was totally in keeping with the idea of tapping that inner reservoir of wisdom, drawing out, your husband drawing Tony out and starting the day that way. And we try to imagine what would in this week of cherishing the children, what an education system would be like that emphasized wisdom more than like the 3 R's or whatever, that it would be this idea of drawing out this already deep wisdom that every child has within. We thought that was really exemplified as well by Doris's story last week about the library with her son and her son's friend, that we think a true education based on wisdom would have a lot to do with ethics and morality, which you were kind of talking about at that museum. So the means and methods for gaining wisdom are quite different than what you would do to gain knowledge. And Renée mentioned this teacher that we had in college, Dr. Iyer, and he used to use this word, this perplexing word a lot, that we would go out on the beach and talk about. And what does this mean? What does it mean? It was this strange word called the dialectic. And we had a lot of discussions about this word, the dialectic, and what does it mean? But what it came to mean to me is, in seeking wisdom, you always start by trying to go from above to below, from universals to particulars. You go from a position, and I think Tony was describing this as well, of introspection, going within into oneself, and then from that place of contemplation, then you go out into the world in terms of action. And after you've engaged in action, then you come back within yourself in terms of reflection, self-reflection, self-study, to get back to that place of introspection. And that's kind of the process of dialectically trying to strive toward wisdom. There's this quote that this Dr. Iyer used to say a lot, and it's been well over 40 years since we had his lectures at the university. But this quote, because of its Zen-like mystery to me, has stuck with me. And I think it tells a lot about what the dialectic is. And the quote is by this Renaissance mystic named Claude de Saint-Martin. And he said that the ideal is only truth at a distance. And it's a mysterious quote. What does that quote mean? But when we look at Gandhi's life, and Gandhi said that his life was his teaching, I think we can maybe understand both this quote and understand Gandhi's life itself by this quote. For Gandhi, the main truth in his life was brotherhood, that we all are of one family. In a lovely book by Arun, his grandson, The Gift of Anger, Arun Gandhi talks about when he stayed at the ashram with his grandfather when he was 12. And that was something that Gandhi would always say, is that we are all of one family. We all are brothers and sisters. It was something that was constantly being taught all the time. But as we know, if truth is, if there's a truth of brotherhood in the universe, but we also know that we're not experiencing it in the world. So there's this gap between the truth of brotherhood and the ideal, which is also brotherhood, to gain brotherhood as an ideal. When Gandhi's ideal of brotherhood was what he called sarvodaya, which is universal welfare, that we're all ideally of one family. We should all have equality and be like of one family in the world, but we certainly aren't exemplifying that at this time. Another thing about Gandhi that I just like to share at the beginning is something that Dr. Tepfer told me about Gandhi, which exemplifies this thing about Gandhi and brotherhood, is that Gandhi wasn't just a theophilanthropist in the classical sense of both a lover of God and man. He was a theophilanthropist he was a lover of God in man. And that was how he approached all of his relationships, is trying to see that essence of God within them. So for Gandhi, the three main principles in his life, which I consider maybe the three pillars of his thinking and his teaching, were satya, truth, ahimsa, which is he's most famous for, nonviolence, and then satyagraha. And satyagraha is literally translated as holding on to truth or firmness in truth. It's also been translated as soul force. But it's what he called all of his campaigns, his civil disobedience campaigns were satyagraha campaigns. And he liked to emphasize that they're always going to be civil disobedience. He always emphasized the word civil. So I'd like to just talk about three events or periods in Gandhi's life that exemplify these three pillars in Gandhi's life and how they bring out this idea of brotherhood as both a truth and an ideal. So Gandhi, as a child and a young man, was a very timid person. He actually had a lot of phobias and fears. He was afraid of snakes. He was afraid of the dark. He was afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of speaking out in public. And he was also especially afraid of being very far from his mother. So it was kind of a shock to him when, after he graduated from high school, one of his close friends of the family said that he should go to England to study the law, because that would be the best way he could make an income for the family, which meant he'd be very far from his mother. His mother made him promise, if he was going to go to England, that he had to not eat meat. He had to stay being a vegetarian. That was his primary vow that his mother made him take. So when he did go to England, he made this vow. He was shocked to find out that at all meals, that's pretty much what the British ate at that time, was a lot of meat. So he pretty much survived on porridge and potatoes for a long time, but he'd like to take long walks. And fortunately, as he took one of his long walks, he stumbled upon a new age, at that time, vegetarian restaurant. And it was a saving grace for him, because now he could have real vegetarian food. At this restaurant, he met a couple of brothers who turned out to be theosophists, and they invited him to come to their society, a theosophical society. And he went to a lot of their meetings, and at these meetings is where he found out about the Bhagavad Gita, by the way. But he also, the first precept of this society was that all men are brothers, that we are all of one family. And also the main motto of the society is that there is no religion higher than truth. And we're speculating here, but we think this might have been a seed that got planted in Gandhi, that of this fundamental truth of brotherhood at that time. And as it grew, eventually, by the end of his life, this small seed that got planted became what everyone saw as this great soul, this great Mahatma. After Gandhi came back to India, he took on his first case as a barrister, and he stood up in front of the court, and he still had not lost his fear of speaking, and he couldn't say a word. So he sat down and shook his head and gave the retainer back to his client and says, "You're gonna have to find another lawyer because I don't know, I can't speak." So he went back home, all embarrassed. And this friend of the family said, "Well, why don't you go to South Africa and join in helping this very wealthy merchant with a big law case down there. Maybe you can get your feet wet in law down there." So he went to South Africa. He met this merchant in Durban, and the merchant says, "Well, the case is going on in Pretoria, so you need to take a train to Pretoria. I'll get you a first-class seat." And he got on the train and he went to Pretoria, and he came to a high mountain pass, and he was sitting in the cabin alone, and in comes a British fellow, and the British fellow said that you need to go to the you're a coolie, you need to go to the third-class cabin or car. And Gandhi says, "No, I have a first-class ticket. I have every right to be here." So he called the porter, and the porter says, "If you don't move to third class, I'm going to get the policeman on the platform and we're going to throw you off the train." He says, "No, in principle, I have every right to be here. I have a first-class ticket." So Gandhi got thrown off the train, and his luggage got thrown down on the platform with him, and he spent a long, cold night on this mountain pass. I think it was kind of a dark night of the soul for him, but this story is often told about Gandhi because I think it was, again, this moment of deep thought for him. And it was in this experience, he showed great fearlessness. He was not, by standing on principle, he was not afraid. And this, I think, is where the seed of ahimsa got planted in Gandhi, is on this cold night on this platform. For Gandhi, ahimsa is not just what is talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, which is the idea, if you get hit on the right cheek or the left cheek, turn your right cheek and accept that as well. For Gandhi, it also was a very active force. Ahimsa was an active force that not only would you do no violence, no violence, you would not stand for violence. In other words, you would not enable violence, or you would not stand quiet when you saw violence happening around you. You would stand up for nonviolence or brotherhood in that context. And so Gandhi spent 20 years in South Africa and did a lot of campaigns based on this idea of ahimsa, and did a lot to change the laws in South Africa to be more equitable and less racist toward both Indians and blacks. But when he came back to India, he came back as a hero, but he decided to start an ashram in India called the Satyagraha Ashram, and to train people to engage in what I consider to be like exponential ahimsa, or ahimsa on steroids, which for Gandhi, this idea of Satyagraha was to take ahimsa, nonviolence, into a field where there was violence and injustice, and to suffer in that field, to know that you're going to suffer, but you're going into that field and suffering to purify that field, and to hopefully change the hearts of those that are perpetrating and inflicting violence, to awaken their hearts and to redeem them as well. So there's this great march that Gandhi engaged in about 1930, called the Salt March. And it was one of his great satyagraha campaigns, where he left from his ashram, called the Sabarmati ashram at that time, and hiked. He was over 60 years old, for 240 miles to the sea to challenge the salt tax and the salt laws that required that everyone that used salt in India had to buy it from the British. So he went all the way down to the sea, and he reached down and picked up one little pinch of salt. But in picking up this one little pinch of salt, he was defying British rule. And the word got out to all of India what he had done, and everybody stopped buying salt from the British, started harvesting it themselves from the ocean and selling it throughout India. So everybody in India was using homemade salt. And so the British at this point decided they were going to act, and they put 60,000 people in jail over this, and including Gandhi. And the viceroy of India at that time, Lord Irwin, realized there's no more room in the jails for all these people. So I guess I'm going to have to kind of negotiate with Gandhi. So he called Gandhi to Delhi, and they had these meetings, Lord Irwin and Gandhi. And after many meetings, 8 meetings over 2 weeks, they were able to come to an agreement, a compromise that actually put the Indians on fairly equal footing with the British to work out how India was to gain its independence from England. It took another 17 years, but that one pinch of salt was all it took symbolically to begin the process of being free from colonial rule. It's an interesting side story that after they signed the agreement, and they were sitting on the veranda, and Lord Irwin brought out tea for them both to drink, Gandhi reached inside his shawl and pulled out a little bag of salt. And he said to Lord Irwin, I'm starting to enjoy a little spice in my tea. And he put a little of this salt in his tea. And then he said to Lord Irwin, why don't we make a toast to the Boston Tea Party? And so they both had a big laugh over that. And they had a laugh over how Churchill would always make fun of Gandhi by calling him a half-naked fakir. So as Gandhi left this meeting, he actually forgot his shawl, and Lord Irwin ran after him with his shawl and gave it to him, joking, saying, we don't want you to go out there in public and someone to take a picture and give Churchill another excuse to make fun of you for your scant clothing. But in the end, it turned out that it was Churchill's empire that ended up having no clothes, because Gandhi actually got what he sought, which was Indian independence. So
325.
Anyways, that's basically some stories about Gandhi and how he used brotherhood with not only with the Indians, but with the British as well, to actually bring about independence, but in a way where the English and the Indians, except maybe Churchill, remain good friends. There you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Cliff, do you happen to remember a story about a woman bringing her little boy to Gandhi with a complaint?
No, I do not. You tell the story.
Okay. Well, so Gandhi had, by the time he got to India, as Cliff said, come home as a hero, and he was known to be a very, very wise man. And so one day a woman came and asked permission to speak with Gandhi, and she got permission. And so she was taken before Gandhi with her son, and she said, Bapu, it's just kind of like grandfather or father, you know. I need you to talk to my boy and tell him he has to stop eating laddu. That's all he wants to eat, which are these Indian, very sugary, sweet balls. all he eats is laddu. Gandhiji, please tell him to stop eating these candies. And Gandhi said, oh, please come back in 1 week. I'll see you then. And so the woman takes her son away and comes back in a week. And she gets an audience again with Gandhi. I get to speak with him. And he turns to the boy and says, son, I need you to stop eating those laddu now. It's really not good for you. And the woman turns to Gandhi and says, Bapu, why did you not tell this to us 1 week ago? He said, because I had to stop eating them myself. And there's something just about, I think, the authenticity and the complete unwillingness that he had to be hypocritical that comes through that story, and that must have an ability to resonate with children. So I think that they see through whatever we do that is hypocritical. And just like Cliff mentioned about Doris with her son and another fellow young man going to the museum, they didn't look old enough to have to pay the higher fee, but Doris knew that she was setting an example when she bought their tickets, and she went ahead and paid the higher fee that their age really required. And so I think that something about Gandhi perhaps just shows children what it means to live a truthful life. It's not just a matter of like how we talk, but how we live, right?
Yeah.
Diana.
Thank you so much. That was really special. I really appreciated that. And I was struck by a couple things you said. The ideal is only truth at a distance. And especially in this day and age with everything that's going on, it's like holding on to the ideal while living the ideal. And that his three things were truth, nonviolence, and holding on to truth or firmness in truth. And I think with all the civil disobedience and protests and all the things that are going on, this is really important. And also what struck me was the 1 grain of sand. That the truth is, if we each do our own 1 grain of sand, even how little that is, that's what we can do. Because it's like we all want to do something to fix this or to have it be different. And if we can just really go inside and find our own wisdom through prayer, meditation, however we do that, and then have it go out and share that. But that 1 grain of salt is enough. And I thought your message was really important considering all that's going on in the world right now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for raising a wonderful son too.
Do you have a comment on that idea of just 1 salt being so representative that if we each just take 1 grain?
I think that's a lovely idea. I'm reminded of the story of George William Russell. He was I think an Irish mystic who said that it's something like, we don't know really what we're doing with our thoughts and our ideas and how we're helping others. And sometimes do you remember exactly how he put it? That we can't know our contribution. We just do the best we can and just renounce any idea of results from it, because it's hard to track exactly the influence of that 1 grain of sand, what it's really going to do.
Robert, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
Well, I had a question. I've always thought of Gandhi when Cliff was talking. If you're going to enter violence with nonviolence, the actual essence of that must be brotherhood. Otherwise, you couldn't be nonviolent. So it just gave another meaning to Himsa to me, that you have to feel like those are your family, Otherwise, you couldn't be nonviolent, I don't think. Or what do you think?
I can tell another little story based on that idea, Robert, because it's just hard to imagine how someone can do that. But the state of being, to be able to enter a field of violence willingly and take it upon oneself with no resistance is staggering. So after Gandhi was put in jail, the leadership of the Satyagraha movement was passed over to a poetess, a woman named Sarojini Naidu, who was a great ally of Gandhi's. And she organized 2,500 Satyagrahis to go to the salt works, this British salt works at Dharasana, and to go and harvest salt from these drying areas. And it's portrayed really well in the Gandhi movie. And they would literally walk up in rows of 25 to the pits where the salt was drying and get beaten down with clubs. And they had their hands at their sides, and they were getting hit in the heads with these metal covered clubs, and their skulls are cracking, their shoulders, their collarbones. It was terrible. After people died, how can human beings do that? They had to have this idea that they were actually a purifying force for India and for those that were striking them, which were also Indians, by the way. There were the 800 Indian policemen that did the striking. But through that, there's a word for this kind of suffering in India called tapas. Through this, bringing the suffering on oneself, and also being seen by around the world. At that point, colonial India or English colonialism lost all its value. And at that point, seeing that it was over for the British Empire in India. Even the British were offended by that. But it's hard to imagine the strength of character to pull that off.
And it's also hard to imagine, at least the way it's portrayed in the movie called Gandhi, which came out, I don't know, maybe 3 decades ago. So it's a wonderful movie. These were not old men who were doing this. This is a lot of younger men too. And so they must have had families. And it's kind of staggering that they felt so convinced in the importance of ultimately throwing off that huge dominating force of the British Empire to have a free country to for their children to grow up in, and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, that they were willing to risk their lives in that way, even if it meant their children might end up without a father. It's kind of difficult to comprehend, but they just kept coming in these sets of 25 and getting stricken down and dragged away by the women, and the next 25 would come and get stricken down. It's mind-blowing, the kind of self-sacrifice that they put themselves to. And it, like Robert was asking, that they must have had such a huge ideal in their mind, of love for something greater than themselves that could carry them through something like that.
One of the things that I really thoroughly appreciated and enjoyed in Cliff's presentation, to me, Cliff, it just really made the point that Gandhi felt so strongly about, which was the primary quality that is needed in so many instances when we're dealing with injustice and violence, was courage. And he felt it's not that people don't know what's right. They usually know or have a good sense of it. The problem is having the fearlessness to do what they know is right. And to me, that linked up with what you were saying in the Gita about Gandhi's devotion to the Gita. And I'm wondering what you just said about the Salt March, and Renee was illustrating too. Do you think that when King when he was in Birmingham, he made the decision to call out the young children to march. And he was heavily criticized for it. But the point is that they wanted to do it. And he felt that this was their declaration of dignity because they were being suffocated by the segregation of the South. And if they could stand, and even if they suffered, it would mean so much to them. And that's actually when they turned the hoses on, and the dogs, and that's what got on television, and that's what became the death knell of segregation. Just to parallel your point with Salt, do you think to any sense that maybe King had learned that from Gandhi?
Well, actually, what I read, Jim, is a little different than that.
Uh-huh.
When they started the Salt March, Gandhi expected to be dealt with rather violently.
Uh-huh.
He said that he made a vow that he would not come back to Sabarmati ashram until the salt laws and salt tax were removed. He says, I can't remember exactly the quote now, but I will not come back here a defeated man, even if it means that I'm going to die and my bones are going to be licked by dogs or something like that. He said something like that, but he chose only to take 78 men with him on this march initially because he didn't want the British to hold back in terms of the violence that they were going to inflict upon them. And he thought if there were women at the front of the march, then the British might be nicer. And he didn't want them actually to be nice. So in that particular case, he chose just men to start on that initial march with him, 78 other satyagrahis. And an interesting story I read about when he formed Sabarmati Ashram based on the idea of fearlessness. When he went out there to look at the place outside of Ahmedabad, it was just a barren land. It was covered, it just basically bare dirt with lots of and grass with lots of poisonous snakes. And he looked to his left and he looked to his right and he goes, this is the perfect place for an ashram for training in satyagraha, because on our left, there is the British prison and on our right is a crematorium. These are the places, most likely places where a satyagrahi is going to end up. So basically his training at Sabarmati was to do experiments with truth and to develop fearlessness, the idea of fearlessness. Now, when Gandhi was put in jail and the campaign got handed over, it was actually handed over to this woman to take over. And at that point, there were a lot of women too that, were dealt with very, very harshly by the British as well. But that was Gandhi's original idea, which is a little different than King's.
Yeah, the only point I would mention there, I totally agree. The whole thing was the training that took place in the ashrams. He wanted elite people out there in terms of truth and nonviolence and satyagraha. But the point was, he saw that most of the masses of India were very passive and very much into feeling one thing and doing something different. And therefore, the point was to have people who would exemplify courage, because that could be contagious. And that was what he wanted people to do, because when it was done at a mass level, it would eventually cripple the British, but more importantly, it would raise the spirit of the people to where they would become more genuinely embodiments of the values of the great values of their culture that goes way back in time. So that was to me what Gandhi was trying to get at in terms of the exemplars become contagious for other people, that it's already there, it has to be awakened. But my question simply was, I wonder if, and it's pure speculation, that if King somehow, that wasn't parallel to him about courage, and if you see it in young people whose minds are being so devalued and suffocated, that if they were to come out and show the courage because they're not trained. They're not people you would expect to. They show the courage to follow in their footsteps of their parents and to do what they did. That would be transformative.
And what happened with King as well as with Gandhi is there was eyes on all of that. And so public opinion shifted
Sure
so
did.
dramatically.
Yeah.
Something I'd like to share is that a recent article I read in the Atlantic about, are we now experiencing America's plastic hour? And in that article,
America's what?
plastic hour.
Plastic?
Plastic hour.
Huh.
It's this idea by an Irish or a Jewish philosopher named Gershom Scholem.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that when you have public opinion shift enough, as well as political power is weakened enough, and there are certain events that arise, especially crises,
Yeah.
there is this possibility in human history for these plastic hours, these hours of great potential for dramatic change in a very short period of time. But the most important ingredient to add to this so that these plastic hours aren't missed as opportunities is leadership, is vision.
Yeah.
And that's like the little pinch of salt that you need for a plastic hour to turn into fundamental change. And Martin Luther King and Gandhi knew that. I think that's an interesting article. I can text it to anyone that'd like to read it, but it's called, "Are We Now Experiencing a Plastic Hour in America?" With all the crises that are happening, which also we seem to be having these great shifts in public opinion and this dynamic in political power going on. So it'd be nice to be 10 years in the future and look back at what we're going through right now and trying to make some sense of it.
So in that sense, in the article, sometimes we think of plastic as meaning fake,
Oh, no.
but you mean, or he means plastic,
Pliable.
able to be molded and formed.
Yeah, it's like a paradigm shift is possible.
The opposite of iron, for example.
Yes.
Yeah, too. It's very interesting about one of the things I find just really wonderful about Gandhi and so helpful and instructive and in daily life is his capacity to respect people who disagreed with him in real ways. I mean, they disagreed and they did not good things. And they learned to still disagree with Gandhi, but respect him and in some sense form a bond with him. If you look at General Smuts, who was such a tenacious, sagacious, almost perverse kind of person in a way in South Africa when he was in charge. And he established a relationship with Gandhi because of Gandhi's particular unusual character of being so inclusive of other people and separating out his disagreement with them from his assessment of them. To the degree to which Smuts sent him a book on religion when he was in prison. But we know the story of when Gandhi finally left South Africa after gaining a certain concession from Smuts and the South African government. He gave General Smuts, a pair of sandals, and Smuts was kind of surprised by it and a bit humbled by it, because Gandhi said, "Yes, I made him while I was your guest in prison, and I wanted to give you a gift." But what is important is later on, someone saw General Smuts in London. And by the way, he became very helpful to the British in the Second World War, and he was very widely respected. But anyway, some journalists saw him, and they said, "Now, do you know that today is the 70th birthday of Mahatma Gandhi?" And he said, "Yes, I'm very well aware of it." He said, "In fact, I will tell you that several days ago, I sent a gift to Gandhi." And they said, "Really, you did? You sent a gift to Gandhi?" He said, "Yes, I did." He said, "I sent him back the sandals that he made me when he left South Africa so many years ago. And when he sees them, he will see that they're very worn sandals because I wore them every summer. And I wrote a note to him congratulating him and saying, I really don't think I'm worthy of wearing the sandals of this man who made, of you who made them. And that was his comment. I find that rather extraordinary.
That's why I took a little bit of time to tell the story about Gandhi's relationship with Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of.
Yeah. It was a similar story, yeah.
Because they were opponents, they were enemies, and yet they maintained a really good friendship. Gandhi, before he started the Salt March, he sent Lord Irwin a long letter. The letter starts with, "My dear friend," and it ends with, "Your sincere friend." And somehow they maintained this wonderful friendship through it all. And I think Lord Irwin wrote a book about how difficult and enigmatic it was to deal, or how enigmatic Gandhi was and how difficult it was to deal with him and negotiate with him. He said it was a lot like trying to fight with a wrestler that's coated in grease, because you can never get a firm grip on him. I also heard the story once of that someone came from Britain, someone in leadership came all the way on a steamer from Britain to argue with Gandhi about all of his shenanigans that he was doing. And he came all the way out, took a rickshaw all the way out to the ashram, super upset. But within an hour, they were both laughing, and somehow Gandhi had completely diffused him. And by the end of the day, it even talked this British fellow into having an enema. So, but that's Gandhi. Gandhi really believed in flushing out yourself. But Gandhi was just an incredibly amazing person in terms of how he could have great friendships with just about anyone, even if they were on the opposite side of some dispute.
It reminds me of the film that was put out about Ruth Bader Ginsburg having a very close friendship with Anton Scalia.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, that's a very good.
They had such opposite views on the Supreme Court, and yet they had a very close family friendship. And there's even a picture of them riding an elephant together
In India.
I think in India, yeah.
In India.
And still they would go back to the Supreme Court and go
do battle.
What a wonderful example. If we were able to do that for our children, to show that it's still possible to have such a high degree of respect and warmth with another human being that we really do not, from a head point of view, see eye to at all, and yet we can still have this heart relationship. I don't know how you do it, but it's a great idea. Does anybody else know somebody like that? Doris?
It kind of reminds me of a childhood friend of mine. Her boyfriend at the time, but now her husband of many years, they would battle it out in judo, just throwing each other and just, battling. And then after, bow to each other, and after class, they would walk out of the dojo, holding hands. So I guess these kinds of things are possible,
I was wondering if it's possibly related to something that Cliff pointed out right at the beginning of his talk about Gandhi's theophilanthropy, that it was not, how did you put it? It was not just God, but God in man. And that's this capacity that he strove for, that he practiced in seeing that which is divine and universal in the other, no matter what may be happening on the exterior, there's always that spark of the divine, and it's honoring that maybe. Do you think? What do you think?
I think so. I think, with every relationship that we have, even with, say, someone at the checkout stand at the market, it's an opportunity for like a golden age encounter. And so I've actually tried to take on the challenge of remembering the names of the people that I meet at stores and restaurants and stuff, so I can say hello to them in a much more kind of like as a friendship, as a personable way. But it was Jim that shared that idea with me, that Gandhi didn't just see, he didn't just have a love for both God and man, but he was able to have a love of God in man. That was the way Jim described it, as he was a philanthropist in that manner. And it's just a beautiful idea that, and a challenge to all of us, to when we go out into the world, to actually be able to see as deep as possible into every person, not to see through a person, but to see into their depths as another divine soul in every encounter. That's the challenge that Gandhi exemplified and puts before us, I think, which you're bringing up.
One can see now why the Pythagorean nightly review is so important, because very often it's so difficult to see things that way. But when you reflect back on the day and you sift out the annoyances or someone being petty or whatever, you can then let yourself see something finer in a person, because you're looking at it through a slightly different lens, I think. And it's a more understanding lens. And in time it grows to where it becomes, I think, more natural.
I wanted to ask a question actually to Dr. Mark. It seems to me that when you're dealing with a lot of different patients, that you may be encountering people who are not even, like, let's say you're in an emergency room kind of situation. They may not even be sober. They may be in all kinds of conditions. And then you walk in there as the doctor. How do you deal with that?
Well, I was touched by what Cliff said about, we started off this discussion with siblings, being siblings and being from the same family. And early on in my training, a senior doctor told me, he said, Mark, just use the mother rule. And the mother rule is, how would you like your mother treated? And I really took that to heart, and I tell my patients that now. You want to try your best. You can't go wrong by doing that. And sometimes as a family, you have to be stern. You have to tell them, you're on the wrong path. Listen, this is not the way to go. And other times you can be very tender and touching and laugh and jovial. I think that's the approach that you take with people. You treat them with respect, but maybe in different approaches depending on what they need at that time.
Yeah.
But I want to thank Cliff, through your years of study and expertise in this area, to share it with us. It's a treat.
Well, my gratitude goes to Dr. Tepfer there, because since both Renee and I were in college together, he and Dr. Iyer were the ones that got us to have a great fondness and love for Gandhi. Dr. Tepfer started when he was in college, the Gandhi King Fellowship that would meet at the kind of the college center at UCSB, and they would discuss Gandhi and King and have all these discussions. So Dr. Tepfer has been a great student of Gandhi his whole life, and I've learned so much from him.
Thank you.
Mary, what's your thought there?
I was thinking that there are martyrs for every cause, because the Christians were martyred. The Indians, like you said, there were people that were beaten and some were killed. Those are martyrs. And we have to respect that they thought enough, they felt strong enough about their cause that they were willing to die for it. And I can think of a few times when maybe I myself might lay down my life for a cause, for an individual. And I applaud all those who have made that commitment and have paid the price. Amen.
I've been thinking a lot about America these days. And when you think back to the writers of the Declaration of Independence, every single one of those people that signed that document were potentially martyrs, because they were basically signing their own death certificate by putting their name to that document. And that the tremendous courage and bravery to actually sign the Declaration of Independence, that's staggering. We forget that by putting their name on that document, if King George had won, all those people would have been executed.
Excellent point. Excellent point.
You know, Cliff, it also reminds me, I almost said it earlier, but it was a little bit sort of a side note on the discussion, but there's this very similar story to what you're saying, this whole idea about being friends with your enemy, about Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence.
There you go.
That he used to, when they were at, in full battle with the British, even in Virginia, in his home state, that he would invite British officers to his home for dinners, for long dinners, and for music, because there were several of them who were excellent musicians. And he, of course, he loved to play the violin, and his wife played was a form of the piano, and music was part of it every evening if he had his way. So he would, this was a kind of one of his ways of extending himself to the enemy, and so anyway, just kind of goes along with the stories you've been sharing with us. So, but thank you so much. It was a very rich presentation and some really key points, beautiful stories, very inspiring.
I'd like to share this one quote. Jawaharlal Nehru, who became the first prime minister of the independent India, was really a great friend of Gandhi's, and actually saw Gandhi as his guru, and was frustrated to no end by Gandhi throughout their relationship. But he was loyal. He was loyal as a friend too. But in looking back at what Gandhi meant, in reminiscing about Gandhi, he had this to say: "We seem to be helpless in the grip of some all-powerful monster. Our limbs were paralyzed, our minds deadened. What could we do? How could we pull India out of this quagmire of poverty and defeatism which sucked her in?" And then Gandhi came. He was like a powerful current of fresh air that made us stretch ourselves and take deep breaths, like a beam of light that pierced that darkness and removed the scales from our eyes, like a whirlwind that upset many things, but most of all, the workings of people's minds. Wonderful quote I stumbled on.
That's a marvelous quote. I've been looking for that quote for years. I remember reading it like 50 years ago, and I've cited it. I just cited the sentiment, but I think this is an autobiography or something, but I didn't remember the whole thing. It's such a marvelous statement, Cliff.
I'll text it to you.
Yeah, thank you. That's just a marvelous way to end. Good heavens.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your careful and attentive listening, for your contributions, and especially for Cliff's beautiful presentation and wonderful responses to comments and questions. Thank you all so very much. I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you, Cliff. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Mahalo, everyone.
Follow Cliff.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. for
Sparkling, thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.